This is a script app that I wrote just to help out with tracking down account errors at work. And it just uses Windows Forms to create a graphical interface, and it displays some of the important attributes that we might have issues with if they're not set correctly. In Active Directory, in Exchange, like custom attribute data, it displays like when an account was created, when it was last accessed, if it's locked, or when the password was changed to help track down stale accounts or accounts that are locking or have password issues and so forth. And it looks like this if I run it. So NAD, when you first run it, it loads the first account in AD, just calling get AD user. And I'll show you all the code behind the scenes in a moment. So you can cycle through records. It loads all the users in Active Directory as a record set. And you can cycle through them. So if I click the next button, it'll go through my users. Starbuck, Adama, Saul, Carly, there's me, test user, Emperor Palpatine, Luke Skywalker, Anakin Skywalker, Twilight Sparkle. I'm just I'll cycle through them quickly here. Notice there's 59 accounts total in AD. Okay, and then when I get to the end there, okay, and remember it's off by 1 because we start counting at 0. So there's 59 accounts, but here I'm counting 1 to 60, but programmatically I'm counting 0 through 59. Okay, so and then there's that built-in administrator account bit. All right, let's say I wanted to look for a specific user, Spark T, which is the same account name for Twilight Sparkle. If I do that, I can type that in. And when I click search, notice it takes me directly to record 13. And there's Twilight Sparkle, and there's all her attribute data. And what if I wanted to look for employee ID 666? 666. Is there an employee is there an employee 666? Yes. That's Darth Vader, Anakin Skywalker, right? He's a bad dude. Okay. We all have an employee 666, right? No, I'm just kidding. For a user principal name, or UPN, let's say that I was going to do Rainbow Dash. Oh, and by the way, notice that it's coded so that whenever you select one of these fields in the search option, it clears all the other fields. Because remember, this is event-based programming, so when I click the search button, I don't want more than one criteria. If I had email and Sam filled out at the same time, that would be conflicting. So I could choose to, incorporate both of those in a search. Maybe I'll rewrite it at a later date to do that. But right now, I'm only allowing searching on one field, right? One field type. So either UPM or Sam or email or employee ID. But I could always go back and change it later. So if I had Sam account, and I don't remember what Rainbow Dash's Sam account name was, but look, if I click on UPN, notice that in this case it erases what's in the Sam account field. Rainbow and then underscore dash and then at battlestars.fleet, okay? And I have this also coded. I have added an event listener for key presses. All right, so if I hit the enter key, I don't have to click on search because I added that event key listener. All right, it listens and it handles a key press, in this case pressing the enter key. While I'm in any of those 4 text boxes, I can also hit the enter key as well as the search button and go directly to that user. And here's Rainbow Dash by her UPN. So that's how that works, okay? Okay, so let's take a look at the code for this script, and it's pretty straightforward. We have a couple of methods here that have been declared, and we have a couple of globals here, but we're gonna do this program flow style. We're gonna step through the code in the same way that the computer would process the code, okay? And sometimes that's the best way to understand someone else's code or a script, okay? So what happens first? First, this function initialize is called. And what does that do? Initialize, it changes the value of this global we have, all users. It calls get AD user, filter is a wildcard, so that's everything, and that's all the properties. And it stores it in this global here. So this global is going to be basically an array, okay, a collection or a list of every account in Active Directory. And remember we did that video on scope? If you don't remember, you can go back and watch that video in the PowerShell series that we did. But so we have two globals here. This is going to be our array, our collection of all the user objects in AD. And this is going to be an index number that we manipulate to get at the subscript, right? The element number, and therefore access a particular user account in our collection of all accounts in Active Directory. So those are the two globals that we've declared in our global namespace. So again, the first thing that happens when we run this, invocation-wise, we call the initialize method. And inside the initialize method, in this initialize function, we populate this global variable. It becomes dynamically an array that holds all the user accounts in Active Directory. Okay? We're going to do a couple other things too. We're going to set the text value, in this case of L, num 80 accounts output. And global users, we're just going to count the number of users in our collection in AD. And we're going to display that, okay? And in this case, then we're going to do, we're going to set the value of T input text. And it's going to be the value of user number. And you know, in this case, the user number, it's going to start out as 1. It'll be initialized that first account. But remember there's that fence post, or that sort of off by 1 issue in Active Directory. So while we start counting as 1, the computer and in arrays, we start counting at 0. So to get at the first user account, the subscript or index value is actually going to be initialized or start out as 0. Okay? And so we do that. And that's what we get there. And we're going to set the text to be that, you know, that record number, and we're going to take the SAM account name, we're going to make that value the SAM account name, and then we're going to change the record number output. The text is going to be set to the user number plus 1. So we're just making it human friendly. Yes, we start counting at 0 in an array in our code, but for displaying it for the end user, we're going to add 1 to it. So that way we count 1 to 60 instead of 0 to 59. Okay? And then we're going to go call this method route display data. And that's going to do some things, okay? Well, first off, let's look at how the form itself is displayed, okay? So we have this here, system.windows.forms.application, run, and then form main. That's the name of our main Windows form, okay? And go through that video. It's a nice, long, comprehensive video on Windows creating GUI interfaces in PowerShell using Windows Forms. And it's in the PowerShell playlists if you need to know more. But this is a more stable way. The normal default way that you show a window, a dialog, or form is to call this show dialog method or function. But in this instance, we're doing it in a more stable way. Okay, and that's just using run and passing in the form name. Sometimes when you do it using show dialog, it's less stable, or there are memory leaks and things, and you close a window and you know, ICE can lock up on you and things like that. So it's just another way of displaying that form, of loading that form. Well, when we do that, that's when all this code happens. And this is what actually creates the graphical user form, right? The GUI interface that we're using. Let me scroll right here. Here's where we'll start. All right, so it's important that I add type assembly name system Windows Forms to be able to use a GUI, and that I scope it to enable visual styles statically in this case, you know, using these two colons. And So here I'm creating my main form, setting the label, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. This is just standard Windows form stuff here. And there's an entire video, over an hour, that goes over every little detail and bits and pieces of this in the PowerShell video series. So there's no point in repeating it, but if you need a review or you need a refresher, just access that video. And all of these methods and these functions and explanations thereof, you will find in that video on creating GUIs for PowerShell. That being said, okay, so here we're creating the form. Here we're creating a label for the title, a label for the number of accounts, and then this is sort of an invisible label that holds the output when we go up and down the record set, previous and next. Or as we search for an item and find it in the record set, that's where that value in orange appears right there. Notice the color difference, right? Orange versus white. Okay, we have group box. Group box for input, and in that group box we add all these labels and text boxes, and this is where we're enabling the user to search for Active Directory accounts under different criteria, be it UPN, be it employee ID, be it email, be it SAM account name. Then we have another group box. Group boxes are great. Group boxes are your friend. They make things so much easier in terms of, once you get your form designed, a lot of times then you have to start manipulating it with code. You can't, you eventually kind of reach a point where it becomes impractical to drag and drop things around in a GUI designer because it ends up kind of tearing up your code. Well, using group boxes are great because you can basically create these panels on your GUI and then add all the components into that panel, and you can move the whole thing around if you want, and it'll move around all the components that are added to it in relative position instead of an absolute position. So it's just a really, again, that video talks about group boxes, talks about all of these different Windows Form components. So I'll try and not repeat myself in this video, but that's all we're doing here. This is all the code we need for that interface. The code to create the labels, the forms, the group boxes, the text boxes, the buttons, you name it. All of that is there. And I'm just going to go down. So all this is code, every label that you saw in that form has to be coded out, has to be named. And then it has to be added. So here we add some labels, and then we add all the group boxes. And each of those group boxes themselves contains labels and buttons and text boxes and text fields, different things like that. So there's all these different group boxes here, which I prefix with GB. You come up with your own system. They get added to the main form. Then also, we have to add event listeners, right? If we're going to click on something, we have to listen for an event to happen. That's event-based programming. It's different from console programming. Coding with a GUI is totally different from coding with the console. We have to listen for an event, a trigger. And when we hear the trigger, the event listener listens. And when it hears the trigger, it goes and it calls the event handler. And the event handler will then call a method or code to execute various functions based on what event was heard, all right, when it was listening, whatever event that it heard. So here's where I'm changing, if the user clicks and therefore selects any of those text boxes, I'm clearing the other 3 text boxes of text. And that way, when they click the search button, it's not going to add conflicting criteria. That's just my simple, easy way of handling it. Eventually, I could get a lot more sophisticated with that. But that's all I'm doing for now. When they click on any one of those text boxes, it's going to clear the other 3 text boxes, okay? So I used add click. I added an event listener for click. And when I hear it, all I'm doing is clearing the text in those text boxes. Now, if they click the search button, it calls route display data. And if they click previous or next, it calls previous and next functions. And we'll go explore what those do in a minute. Also, if they hit the enter key, I want it to process whatever text box they're in, be it SAM account, be it UPN, be it employee ID, whatever. I want it to process based on that criteria. That way, if they're in a hurry and they don't want to move their mouse and click on the search button, they can just hit the enter key. Well, if I'm going to do that, in the same way I have to have event listeners for clicking in the text boxes, and I have to have add click event listeners and handlers for when they click the buttons, I have to add an event listener and an event handler for key presses, okay? So in this case, I call it keys listener, all right? So I'm going to create or instantiate and build an event handler based on key presses. And this key code attribute, I could say enter key or tab or, N or letter T or whatever. In this case, I want the enter key. And if I hear it and it equals that, what am I going to do? I'm going to go call the same thing I would do if they click the search button, which simply calls the method or the function route display data. So I call perform click on the search button, and it's therefore going to call route display data. It does the same thing. So that's how I've coded it to accept, the enter key as input, as well as clicking on the search button. If I didn't add this in, and then add, key listener is the name of the event handler that I built. That's the instance of it. And then I have to add it to the key down. I have to add this event handler to this event listener all the way down on all my text boxes. And that way you can hit the enter key as well as click the search button. Either way, it'll do the same thing, okay? Okay, so last, not least, let's just look at previous and next, and then we're going to jump to route display data, which is where the real action happens, okay? So previous and next, they're very similar in terms of their logic. Remember when we loaded this form at the very beginning and initialize, we grabbed all the users in Active Directory and we assigned them to that global, and they're held inside that array, okay? Well, we have to look at this, and the only thing we need to be careful is we don't want to let them go past 0. There is no -1 Active Directory user. There's no -5 active. You understand? That would break things. That would cause our program to crash. So we have to bulletproof things just a little bit here. And by saying that, in other words, we want to make sure the user doesn't do something that's going to hurt them. That's going to cause the program to do something it's not supposed to do. So in this case, we're saying if the user number -1 is greater than or equal to 0. Because if they click on previous, okay, let's say the previous value was 1. They're going to 0. Well, okay, we'll let them do that. Because remember, we start counting at 0, not at 1, in computer reads or in an array. But on the other hand, if it was already 0 and they clicked on previous, there's no -1. We can't let them do that. And so we put this whole block of code inside of an if block, and if and only if, when they click that button, if they happen to be on a record number that is not 0, right? Because when they click on it, if we subtract 1, it has to be greater than or equal to 0. Only then will we allow them to execute and run this code, okay? So let's say it's valid. Let's say they were on record 5 and they click previous and they go back to record 4. What happens? We postfix decrement our global user number. We will set the text with that SAM account name. And then we will set the record to be whatever value it is, whatever value it was. Now it's 1 less. But remember, it's off by 1. We always add 1 because humans don't start counting at 0. Humans start counting at 1. Be mindful of that fence post or that off by 1 error whenever you're using arrays or accessing arrays. It's a very common logic mistake. It won't show up as a syntax error, but it'll be a logic problem later in your program because you'll always be 1 off. 1 too many or 1 too less. If you don't remember or keep it in the back of your mind that arrays, computers think or start counting at 0. They don't start counting at 1. Okay, and then we call route display data. Well, the next function is the same. It's just the logic has been inverted, right? So we can't allow them to go past the maximum number of objects in AD. If there's only 59 user accounts in Active Directory, we cannot allow them to access user account 60 because it doesn't exist, and that would crash the program. So we have to do just a bit of bulletproofing. And so we say, if we add 1 to whatever number they're on, if it's less than or equal to the entire number of objects, say in this case 59, then and only then will we allow them to run this block of code. So if they were on object 58, we add 1 to it, it's 59, and global all users.count has a value of 59, that's less than or equal to. So yes, we would let them run the code. And they could then move from user 58 to 59, but hypothetically say that they're on user 59. That's the total number of users in AD. And they try to add 1 to that and go past that last user. There is no user 60. Well, then this would no longer be true. It would no longer be less than or equal. And actually, in this case, yeah. So you follow what I'm saying? Actually, in this case, we could say less than or equal to. So 59, if they go to 60, it's no longer less than or equal to, it's greater than. And then in this case, we don't want them to run this block of code. It's inverted. We're doing a postfix increment instead of a postfix decrement. And same thing, same account name, adding 1 because it's off by 1, and calling route display data. So with our previous next, initialize, or search, all the action is now moved to the function route display data. All right, this is sort of the key behavior of our application. So let's go take a look at that. What's going on inside route display data? What the heck's going on there? So we have an object and we initialize it to be null. Okay, and we're going to check and make sure that the text field is not empty. If the text box input upn.text is not equal to nothing, okay? So if there's something actually there, and remember we coded it so that whenever you click on one, it clears the text out of the other 3. So whichever one of these has a value in it, that's the block of code we're going to run. The rest of these blocks of code would never run because remember these tests, this if block, it's only going to happen if the text is not equal to nothing. I know that sounds weird, it's a double negative, but in other words, it can't be empty. If UPN is not empty, then the other 3 text boxes are empty, and that means that the user is wanting to search for by the UPN or the user principal logon name. Same thing for SAM account. If SAM account is not empty, that means they want to search by the SAM account. And that means that because of the previous code, we've already cleared the other 3 boxes, so that this would then be the only criteria. And the same for email, and the same for employee ID, okay? So the logic is basically the same inside of each of these blocks, but we need to get something different to happen each time based on the criteria they're searching on. So what happens? Criteria is going to be either set from UPN, or SAM, or email, or employee ID. Logic is the same, right? The only thing that's changing in each block of code is the source that we get the text value from. So that becomes criteria, it's stored in criteria, and then what happens? We are going to get an AD user, filtering it based on the criteria, and based on the attribute, in this case, user principal name, if it comes from the UPN text box, SAM account name, if it comes from the SAM text box, email address from the email text box, and employee ID from the emp ID text box. All right, so filter and we've gone over that, and we're going to get all the properties for that user account. And then what do we need to do? Here we have a for loop, and we're going to go through all the objects in the array because we need to get, there is no index or subscript value yet. If we search for a user, it's totally random. That might be user number 40, that might be user number 3, it might be user number 7, who knows? So we have to find the index or the subscript value of that user and then change the counter field to match it. So we have to bring order back to the chaos, right? The user creates chaos. They randomly select some record. We have no idea what it's going to be. We can't just increment or decrement. In this situation, if they're just clicking previous or next, sure, we can add 1, we can subtract 1. But if they're searching, that's a totally random operation. So what we need to do is go back and re-index the value, all the subscript values, and find what number element that user account is in our collection and our array of objects. So that's what this for loop is for. And it's in each block of logic. So while x is 0, while x is less than global all users count, however many users are in AD, increment x, so we're going to cycle through, and then what? If that subscript value, that user account, and the user principal name has to match here, right, equals the criteria, then what happens? User number becomes x. So that's how we find the user did something random, they created chaos, we have no idea what choices they're going to make. That's event-based programming for you. But now we can resequence and we can find that index value again, and then we can display it in the label record number output.text. And again, we're just adding 1 to make it more user-friendly. We count 1 to 60, computer count 0 to 59. Potatoes, potatoes, tomatoes, tomatoes, same thing, but you kind of get the idea, right? So same logic all the way down, except that the criteria must match. User principal name, SAM account name, SAM account name. Email address, email address. Are you with me? So we're just finding what they search for based on the text field that's not empty. The other 3 are empty because of the previous code that, remember, every time they click on one text field, it clears the other 3. And now we go through all those objects and we find the index value, and we bring order back to our world. We rectify the chaos that the user has created, so to speak, okay? And then what if we didn't find anything? What if they searched for Pikachu and we don't have a user called Pikachu in Active Directory? Well, in that case, remember when we started this function, the user was set to be null, right? It's nothing. So we check for that. And if the user is still null, we're just going to display a message, unable to find that account. And we have 2 large text boxes, one for group membership, which could be potentially long, and one for member of, which can hold LDOP strings. So we're just going to display that in those text boxes, kind of recycle them in our output. Okay? And only if it's not null, we're going to call check user. We do not want to call check user if we didn't find that account. If the user is null and we call check user, it's going to crash and create all kinds of horrible errors, because this function will pull all the attribute data for that user account. So we have to do a lot of checking before we allow check user to be called, right? And we have. So if we get here, and if the user is no longer equal to null, then and only then, in this else block of code, can we call check user and pass in the user object as an argument to the user object parameter, okay? And then last but not least, we don't have to, but as a matter of convenience, I'm going to clear, and I might add the other 3 text boxes. We don't have to, but I think it would probably be a good idea to clear those text boxes after every account is searched for. You don't want to necessarily leave old data, because if the user's not thinking, or they don't remember to delete or remove the text or click on a different text box, then they might inadvertently or accidentally do something to the same user account when they're really wanting to access another account. It's up to you. I guess it's a matter of preference, but I'd probably put in here the other 3, the UPN box, the employee ID box, and the email text box. I'd clear those as well, optional. But anyway, if we call this, we've done the work of checking to make sure that the user's not null, that they actually do exist in Active Directory, and they did find a valid user. And so then this function, what it does is it just grabs that user account. It's already been validated. We know that it exists. We know that it's real. It's good. We're good to go. So we call check user, and what happens? We go through and we get all that attribute data based on the user object itself, just using the dot operator. And again, if you want more understanding of this, go and watch that PowerShell video on classes. And it talks about how classes are structured and how they work. And you'll see this is how AD is set up. These are classes of objects with attributes, data members, accessor methods, private data, public data, protected data, and we're accessing that using the dot operator. And then we're just going to set the text value of all of our labels to match what that attribute data is when we display that text box, okay? Going all the way down, all this extension attribute data. And we haven't installed Exchange yet, but eventually I'll change this to custom attributes 1 through 15, which is added once you install Exchange, you know, the email application in AD. But that's essentially the program, the application, okay? So again, if we run it, and notice when we click on next, look at the account, you know, right over here, watch as the account number changes. And notice here, right, Adama, and it's just giving us attribute data. Here's the Carly account, unicorn, quirk, musician, hippie, chicks, or whatever. But okay, you know, home directories depending on who has a home directory. All right, so I'm sequencing up and down, previous to next, and that's calling route display data. But again, I can search for a particular employee. If I look for employee ID 666, there's Darth Vader, right? And if I click over here and Sam, let's say I type in Spark T, okay? And I'm just gonna hit enter because I have the event handler for enter. There's Twilight Sparkle, right? And there's her attribute data. And notice, you know, here I've resequenced the index value. So again, I can go back and forth. And I'm going to go all the way to the very first account in AD. And notice if I click previous, it doesn't let me go past administrator. That's exactly what we wanted, right? We wanted to bulletproof it. We don't want a negative value. Because if I went to 0, because it's off by 1, I'd actually be accessing -1, and that would generate an error. It would crash my program and create all kinds of problems. So again, I'm going to click and cycle through these accounts here in AD. And then that way, if I had a problem, you know, this just gives me like the SID, the GUID. I can get when the password was last changed, password not required, account expires. So this just helps me track down, you know, map to the home directory, the LDAP location. Just helps me track down problems that we have in different accounts.